Do you notice anything in this footage? Every single one of these groups was called the same exact thing by people in power. But here's what they don't want you to know. This isn't coincidence, this is a playbook. And today, while I do my makeup, I'll be talking about the 5 steps every empire uses against resistance fighters. And trust me, once you see the pattern, you won't be able to unsee it. Do you guys know that the British Empire, the same empire that lectures us today about human rights and democracy, once called Gandhi's independence movement? Yes, Gandhi, the guy who was literally all about nonviolence. To the Brits, he was a... And why, may you ask? Well, it's the same reason why the French called the Algerian freedom fighters bandits, why Israelis called Palestinian resistance fighters terrorists, and even why the Americans called the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, terrorists while funding them through NORAD, which was another Irish organization. Calling resistance or independence movements or violent is done by design, because it's either that every single person in these resistance movements are pure evil, or that empires use the same exact playbook when it comes to addressing these independence movements. Spoiler alert, it's because they all use the same playbook. And there are 5 steps that they use every single time. The first step of the empire's playbook in addressing resistance movements is labeling them as... Now, it doesn't matter if people are fighting for their homeland, for freedom, or for independence, they're going to be hit with the same label. We saw this in 1916 when the British referred to the Easter Rising, which was an uprising from Irish people, an armed uprising against the British on Easter, after conscription was instilled or enforced throughout Ireland, okay? And the conscription was basically forcing Irish people to serve for the British Army. Okay, now if you don't know anything about what happened between Ireland and Britain, the UK had a lot of control, or basically held Ireland under occupation for a while, and of course the Irish people hated it and they wanted their independence. So the Easter uprising was just a couple of days after Easter, or during Easter, and after that, when the Irish basically put up arms and they started fighting the British. Now, it ended pretty quickly, but the British labeled this armed resistance as terrorism, even though the Irish were literally just fighting for their independence from who? The British. The French also did this to the Algerians back in the 1950s, and they would call Algerian rebels bandits or for fighting against the French and wanting their country back from the French. And now we see the same thing happening with Palestinian resistance, where Palestinian fighters are labeled as for going against the Israeli occupation and the Israeli siege, which are both illegal, by the way, and wanting freedom and autonomy. It's almost like there is a playbook that gets passed down from empire to empire, and honestly, it works, because plenty of people will look at what's happening right now or in the past and say, yeah, all these people who are fighting for their freedom are not freedom fighters, but they're... So they do it because it works. All right, now step 2 in the empire's playbook in responding to resistance is control the story. Now, this is really important when addressing resistance, because when you are able to control the narrative and paint resistance fighters as something negative, you also control people's response or people's perception on how you respond to this resistance, okay? So this is a really imperative part of the empire's playbook. The British did this to the Indians back in 1857. They used to call the Indians who rebelled against British forces bloodthirsty natives or mutineers or whatever, like just all these names, trying to control the narrative and paint rebellion against immoral and unjust rule over a territory that doesn't belong to them as, just pure violence and unprovoked violence. And that's a big part of controlling the narrative, right? It's just like making people think that, oh, these fighters are just coming out of nowhere and just fighting for no reason because they're inherently violent. So we're actually doing the right thing by fighting against them and causing harm to millions of people, because these people are just savages. That is how they control the narrative, and that is what they do to, again, make it seem like what they're doing is okay, and also avoid any criticism for their response, which is usually extremely catastrophic. We saw this with the French, again, with the Algerians. They were calling Algerian fighters as uncivilized. Meanwhile, the French were literally torturing people in detention camps. Like, who is the uncivilized person there? And don't even get me started on how the Western media is covering what's happening in Palestine, in Myanmar, or in Kashmir, all these people who are fighting against ethnic cleansing and occupation are labeled as just uncivilized. The only thing that's really uncivilized is the ethnic cleansing and the occupations themselves. All right, now this is the third and probably one of the more darker steps of the empire's playbook against resistance, and that is collective punishment. When empires fail to find the their solution is to punish everyone. The British actually did this during the Boer War. They were unable to successfully get Boer fighters. So what they did was lock up Boer women and children into detention camps and basically torture and 28,000 people in this instance. The Nazis also did this. For every German soldier that was, they 50 to 100 civilians, same logic. And we see this in Gaza for sure. They can't stop Hamas, so what do? They entire neighborhoods and blocks and homes, destroy the water, cut off gas and internet, the journalists, hospitals, just whatever they can do to cause as much damage as possible and disguise it as self-defense. The same thing happens in Kashmir. If they can't stop the militants, then what they'll do is they will just start setting curfews and just limit people's lives, real lives and regular lives through these curfews. Same in Myanmar. They can't find the people that they're looking for, so they will burn down entire villages. And the pattern is always the same. If you can't beat the resistance, the solution is to punish the entire population. And you see this very clearly in Gaza, for example. They will literally just ruin the lives of 2 million people in Gaza right now. And the purpose of this here and in these other instances is to basically get the collective population so angry and tired and exhausted and weak to the point where they will start blaming the resistance fighters. So that will increase pressure on the fighters and also, help the empire to win and have victory. But ultimately, all of these countries are better off just being independent without these wicked empires down their throats causing all this destruction out of greed and whatever else. Okay, now step 4 of the empire's playbook is chef's kiss, diabolical, and that is divide and conquer. Now this is a tried and true practice, and we see this quite literally everywhere, because one of the easiest things to do is turn people against one another, especially when they're oppressed. Now the British were actually masters at this. They spent 200 years telling Hindus and Muslims that they were natural enemies, and this caused so much fighting and division to the point where it still exists today, by the way. But this made it that much easier for the British to come in and conquer the divided territories. So what the British did was that they would create separate laws and separate candidates, separate everything. And when independence came and chaos followed because of all the division, the British would come in and be like, see, these people can't handle autonomy themselves, they need us. And that kept their grip on the Indians for a long, long time. The French did the same thing in Algeria. Arab versus Berber, secular versus religious, rural versus urban. They were really good at finding the cracks within a society and just widening them. And we also see this today. A lot of people don't know this, but Israel funded Hamas in the 80s to stop PLO, which was the competing or opposing power in the Palestinian territories. America did the same thing with supporting opposing factions in Iraq and Syria. The strategy is basically create chaos and then point to the chaos as a justification for your presence there, and then turn your presence into conquering the area and taking it for yourself. It's unfortunately so obvious, but people fail to see it every single time. Now, step 5 of the empire's playbook in addressing resistance is claim moral superiority. And this is my personal favorite because of how insane it is. But basically what they will do is, instead of claiming or taking responsibility for their actions, they will actually say they're not the oppressor, they're the civilizer. They're not the occupier, they're the liberator. And when I say they, you know exactly who I mean. Now, the British called this the white man's burden, which you've probably heard of if you attended high school, or maybe not, I don't know. But basically, it's just their rationale of coming in to places and taking their resources. They weren't doing it because they wanted to steal everything and conquer. They were doing it to bring democracy and civilize and liberate, or bring Christianity, or spread God's word to the uncivilized and unknowing man. How generous of them. The French also did this. They had their civilizing mission, insisting that they weren't colonizing, they were simply teaching African people to be human. Americans did the same thing by bringing democracy to the Middle East, right? Libya, Iraq, Syria. It doesn't matter that they've completely destroyed these places, at least they're free, right? And as a Palestinian, I always hear this, that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, which I find so funny, but obviously not funny, because thousands of Palestinians are unable to return to their homes because it's now a Jewish-only settlement. Some kind of democracy, that is. Although I shouldn't say that because it's democratic for the right people. Okay, now where do we see this playbook being used today? basically everywhere. Palestine checks all 5 boxes. Myanmar, all 5 boxes. Kashmir, all 5 boxes. These tactics are actually so standardized, you can almost predict the next move. Because again, it's a playbook, right? When resistance emerges, they call them. When the media starts to cover an empire's response, they control the narrative. You can't stop them, collective punishment. Getting international criticism, divide and conquer. Still getting criticism, claim moral authority. And the thing is, recognizing these patterns doesn't make you anti-American or anti-Israel or anti-anything. It just makes you media literate and historically literate. Because once you see the playbook, you can't be manipulated by it anymore. And then you start to ask the right question. Who benefits from this conflict? Who's writing the story? Who's controlling the narrative? And what's the historical context that they're not telling you? So the next time you see resistance labeled as, ask yourself, who's using the empire's playbook? What step are they on? And most importantly, what are they trying to hide? And this is exactly why I do this series, Lessons for the World. Because history often repeats, and if it doesn't repeat, it will certainly rhyme. And if we don't learn from these patterns, we are definitely doomed to keep watching them play out over and over again. So I hope you liked this video and learned something. Let me know in the comments any historical patterns that you are aware of that I maybe didn't mention, or other historical patterns you want me to break down. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, all sources in the comments.